Hello and welcome to episode 58, and I thought today we'll have a look at Lavaliere microphones. Now, one of the things that's so common nowadays on YouTube, of course, is that everybody wants to see the huge, great big microphones. So, what we got? Here's mine, the SM7B, the one we use as a comparison microphone. But what about if you don't want to see big microphones? So in actual fact, let's switch to another one. So what's the point of a Lavaliere microphone? Well, most of the things are going to be quite small. This particular microphone is a very small Lavaliere, and this in actual fact is a really cheap one. I bought this from China when I needed to do some violin recording, and I needed to get some lav mics close, and it came with a nice little rubber mount, and you could clip it to the tailpiece of the violin and get that little element quite close in, and it did a pretty good job. And it was about £30 or so. It wasn't particularly expensive, but it is actually rather small. I've not seen them for sale in anything other than these little violin kits, but I was quite impressed with it. It didn't sound too bad, so we'll use that in a minute to record my voice as well. The other sorts of microphone, well, I've had this one a while. This one is an Audio Technica, and like that little Chinese version we had, it's also an omnidirectional microphone. Most times that we use lav mics, we're going to want to do omnis. Now the reason being that if we're going to use something like one of these, we don't really have much control over where we point it. So an omni can be clipped, and it doesn't have to point directly at the mouth. In actual fact, a lot of times you'll see people, certainly if you watch things like news programs on TV, you'll see them where they've got longer mics like that, and they'll be pointing downwards. So they'll clip them on with a little crocodile clip, and they face away. Works perfectly fine for audio, of course, but the best bit is having the little hole on the mic facing downwards means that the explosive breath noises people make, the coughs, the pees, the bees, the bangs, all those sort of things, can't get in the hole, because lav mics are quite sensitive things, and the one thing they're very, very prone to is blasts from audio. Let's just use this as a good example. The little tiny microphone here, and it's very small. What would that be? It's probably about 5 or 6 millimeters across, quarter of an inch, and something like this is available in all sorts of colours to match different skin tones. So they come in sort of from jet black like this one, which is probably the favourite of people who want to use them for news and stuff like that, and they don't really mind the fact that they're black. They're fairly neutral colour. They go, you know, they'll sort of be a contrast against most clothing. And you can hide that on somebody. But if you look hard, you might see it. If you're doing it for stage use, well, in that case, then what you might end up is having them, well, in some shows, they'll actually be taped to people's foreheads. So if they're wearing a wig, they'll come through the underneath of the wig and then be dressed down. And so you just buy them in the colour that matches their skin tone, stick them on there, and the people in the audience probably don't even notice them. If you do see them, they've been put there rather sort of ham-fistedly. If you use the wrong colour, or you use huge great bits of tape to stick them there, then they can be quite sort of ugly looking, a bit like a wart. Now, some of them can be quite small, and if I go across to the other camera, so now we're on this camera here, I'm actually wearing a lav mic, and you've been listening to my voice on the lav mic from very nearly the start of the program. So we started on the SM7B, the one that you can see in this picture, and we swapped over to a Countryman B6, which is one of my favourites. All of these microphones sound extremely close. The Countryman B6 mics are, I think from memory, 3 millimeters across. They're absolutely tiny, and it's actually in one of the buttonholes There you go. Now the B6 is actually coming out of that buttonhole on my shirt. So it's really small, and it's just so easy to hide one of those. You might have to be a bit more creative getting the people from your wardrobe department, if you have one, or yourself if you don't, into hiding these things. But in actual fact, with a few pins and clips, you can easily hide them inside. Now, one of the annoying things about lav mics is that because they're very sensitive, they are a bit prone to noise coming up at the microphone cable. So it's very important to make sure that you don't have any tight points. So, fit them so that when people bend over, the cables don't get really tight. Because if they do, any noise of them touching your costume or touching your body is going to go up the cable and you'll be able to hear it in the microphone. They are pretty useful things to do, to have in your arsenal of microphones, and they've evolved quite nicely since the early days. Now, one of the things that everybody sort of seems to forget is, we call them lav mics, Lavaliere, if you're French. And Madame Lavaliere was actually well known historically for wearing very large jewels in the centre of her chest. And so the early Lavaliere microphones were generally a little tiny piece of chain or cord and a fairly chunky microphone. I mean, if we think back to the sort of things like the 50s and the 60s, we didn't really have miniature microphones, we had quite chunky ones. So it's quite common for things like Shure 545 microphones, which nowadays we view as sort of the modern SM57, but something that chunky with a slightly shorter body would be wrapped on a little mount, hung off a chain round people's necks, and people would do interviews like that. It's crazy stuff, really. I mean, it looked a bit odd. Some of those microphones were huge. When you do mount lav mics on the chest, there is also another slight snag that you need to be aware of. If you tap your chest bone at the front, you can hear a sort of hollow thud. Inside you is a big cavity, isn't it? I mean, you're not solid inside. There's lungs and stomachs and all the other bits and pieces that you've got inside your body. So it is actually a cavity in there, and it will make a noise very similar to a drum. So it produces a sort of peak in the frequency response, and it's, for a fella, sort of the top end of their voice, so it can be a sort of resonant hump, as if you turned up an EQ knob and made it sound a little bit honky in the middle. And lots of the microphones back in the 50s and 60s had to have some fairly savage EQ to make them sound acceptable. That said, of course, the convenience of not having to have a close microphone in shot was viewed as a sort of real godsend. So people were very happy to have slightly maybe less quality sound, but have a microphone that wasn't too obtrusive. Remember that in TV up until, well, we're still using them today, but it's not that common, microphones overhead are still a good way to get audio for TV. We seem to be a bit obsessed with this getting close business nowadays. So we want to get in very close, and we want to have microphones that have got that sort of in-your-face sound. Well, most of your favourite sitcoms from the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, right up to the ones that we've got on TV at the moment that are being made now, will still use overhead booms. And the microphones cannot be close because the cameras will see them. And we've got quite used to that sound. On YouTube, especially on YouTube, we're a little bit obsessed with having whacking great big microphones, and it seems to be a fashion thing rather than anything to do with audio. Just for info, you're listening to this B6 through a Sennheiser wireless link. Now, this particular one is actually a G2, so it's not even current series. It's a G2, and I've had lots of these, and they've been pretty bomb-proof. I quite like them. They are fairly neutral sound-wise, but unless you really need people to be able to be totally hands-free, wander about and have no wires, Wireless links are always going to be a second best. The one thing to remember about wireless is that the most expensive radio mic system is nearly as good as a 10 quid XLR cable. And realistically, that is true. You know, a wireless link will never be as good as a wired connection. It'll come extremely close nowadays, but it will never be as good. Gain is a big, crucial thing to look after on these things. These have actually got two settings, so you can actually have normal gain. You can dial in minus 10 dB or minus 20 dB if the sound source is going to be really loud. Really loud, what do I mean? Well, the B6s that I'm using here, this one that I'm using that's hidden, the B6 is available in quite a few different versions, and they go from the sort of thing that you could stick on the head of an opera singer to something that you can put on a softly spoken person to do narration. So this is the general one. I think it's called the W4 version, which I think is just the ordinary one. But you can actually get these special ones that are designed to be much more suitable gain-wise for something like an opera singer voice close in, because they're damn loud. The normal one can go up to crazy volume levels before it distorts. But just to get a bit of extra headroom for those really extra specially loud events that you might be involved in, you can get a version of this with that. We'll take this little violin mic, £32, and that's in contrast with about 400 for a Countryman B6. So we're considerably, it's 10 times cheaper. So if I hold this on my chest at the same distance as where the B6 is, we're now on this 32 quid Chinese microphone. And there is a difference in the audio. It's not a huge difference, and with a bit of EQ, which I haven't used here, this is all you're hearing is exactly what's coming off the microphone. So this is hardwired into the Zoom recorder. So it's an omnidirectional microphone, so originally designed for a violin, but it's plugged into the Zoom, and it's in exactly the same place as that B6. So it's an interesting comparison to do. Is the B6 really worth 10 times as much money? It's very small. It sounds nice, but that's a lot of money, isn't it? Okay, let's try something else. This is the Audio Technica BP899. Comes in the 898 version, which is a cardioid, but the 899 is omnidirectional, so I can turn it all the way around. Makes no difference which way it points. If I do point it towards me, then P's and B's might react a bit differently. Turn it away from me, the P's and the B's are not going to make much difference. So I don't use this one quite so often. It's longer and a bit thin, so it's just a slightly different shape. It might be easier to dress into something if you have to do it, but it's okay for clipping them on. Does the job. This particular version is a wired 1.2. It's again connected to the Zoom. So now in the same place we've got the B6. So the B6 is the tiniest one, the 3mm one. We've got the B6. We've also got the Audio Technica 899, and we've got that 30 odd pound Chinese one as well. So there's not exactly wild differences between these. I think the Audio Technica currently is about 250-ish price wise, and it's quite nice if you need to sort of hide a small lav on musical sources. So it's quite neat. It does work quite nicely on the violin using the little rubber mount that came with the Chinese one, I've noted. So that's actually quite nice. It's a bit lacking if I use it on my double bass. It needs to be a little bit sort of bigger, I suspect. These small diaphragms just don't really react too well to very, very low bassy instruments. But I think we can get away with that one. But realistically, what do we think? We've got from 30 quid, 250, 400. Is there really that sort of difference? I would love to be able to say that the B6 at £400 is a much more reliable microphone. In actual fact, they're not, because most of these type microphones get destroyed by accidental misuse. That's the big problem. So they get damp, people accidentally spit into the flipping things. The usual one is they'll drop off and land on the floor and someone will stand on them. Very often the actual microphone survives the standing on, but it manages to wrench the cable out somehow. And while some claim that they are repairable, I mean, the reality is they're not. You can jet them out with a sort of one of those little cans of spray air, so you can sometimes get some of the sort of spitty type stuff out of them. But once they get nasty, then realistically you throw them away and buy another one. Well, 32 quid for the Chinese one is a sort of disposable microphone, I reckon, in my book. 400 is not disposable at all. But realistically, if you're working in the theatre like I do a lot, it's quite easy at the end of a run to have half a dozen or so Countryman or DPA 4006s, something like that. And it's quite common to have half a dozen of those that you've ruined in the course of perhaps 6 to 8 weeks. That's a big running cost, isn't it? So lav mics are tricky things to keep going. They've changed quite a lot over the years. Generally, they've got a bit smaller. They haven't really changed too much in tone, but we're still using them. Now, the favourite thing, of course, will be headset microphones. And I'm going to do a separate video on headset microphones because the pros and cons of using those are quite different, I think, to using clip-ons. These are okay, clipped on, they're okay if they're dressed in a wig. I've seen them stuck on people's faces with tape and that just looks ridiculous. But you can do it. I mean, Sennheiser actually used to sell a headset mount that was a big, chunky, huge thing. And you put a little dinky microphone on the end and it looked, frankly, it just looked a bit silly. It looked like something of a science fiction movie. So making these things transparent so you don't really see them, but they pick up decent audio is perfectly possible if you're prepared to put a bit of effort in. If you want to use them outside, you're definitely going to need one of those hairy windshields because they are so prone to noise. A little tiny gentle breeze will sound like a gale with a lav mic. 2 reasons. You're far enough away that you've got to turn the gain up a little bit. The microphones don't know the difference between the wanted audio and wind noise, so they're just doing their best. But the worst bit is, because they're quite small, as the wind blows over the top of the microphone, it does sound like a gale. Sometimes you can't even detect the wind on your face, and the microphone is hearing all sorts of things. So the critical thing with a lav is you always need to listen. So don't risk recording with them without hearing what they sound like, because you could end up really badly disappointed. That's the end of this one. Lav microphones, bit of a primer really, just to give you something to think about, and then we'll talk about some ear systems in a forthcoming video. So look after yourselves, take care, see you on the next one.